One warm evening after a long day of traveling, Jesus and his disciples arrived at a quiet village nestled in the hills. As the golden light of the setting sun bathed the landscape, they found a peaceful courtyard surrounded by olive trees. The air was fragrant with the scent of blossoms, and the distant sounds of villagers finishing their daily tasks created a sense of calm. The disciples, weary from the journey, sat down to rest beneath the shade of the trees. The day's encounters with the people had left them reflecting on the many problems they had been asked to help solve. Family disputes, sicknesses, conflicts between neighbors, and the worries of daily life. The weight of these concerns seemed heavy on their hearts, and soon their conversation turned to their own frustrations in dealing with such challenges. Andrew, always thoughtful, spoke first. "Master," he said, "as we walk among the people, we are asked to help them with so many burdens. But often, their problems seem so large and complicated that we do not know where to begin. How can we guide them when the solution seems so unclear even to us?" Peter, who had been brooding quietly, added, "Yes, Lord. I try to help, but it seems that for every solution I offer, another problem arises. I feel as though I am pulling at a knot that only grows tighter the harder I try. What are we to do when faced with such overwhelming difficulties?" The other disciples nodded in agreement, each of them feeling the weight of their responsibilities. They were followers of the Master, but they often felt ill-equipped to solve the complex problems that people brought to them. The sense of helplessness was growing within them. Jesus, who had been listening quietly, looked at his disciples with a deep understanding in his eyes. He could see their weariness, not just of body but of heart. After a long pause, he spoke softly but with authority. "You speak of burdens that weigh heavy upon you, of problems that seem too tangled to solve. Let me tell you a story of a woman who faced a similar struggle." The disciples immediately quieted, leaning in to listen. They knew that Jesus' stories always held deeper truths, ones that spoke directly to the heart. With the calmness of a teacher who understood his students' needs, Jesus began. ######, the story of the weaver and the tangled threads. There was once a master weaver in a small village much like this one. She was well known for her extraordinary skill. Her tapestries were more than just works of art. They were stories, woven into fabric with the most vibrant colors and intricate patterns. People came from far and wide to admire her work and to commission pieces from her. Each tapestry she made was unique, filled with life and meaning. One day the weaver prepared to begin her greatest project yet. She had planned it for months, envisioning a tapestry that would depict the beauty of the world, its landscapes, its people, and the stories that connected them all. Her heart was full of excitement, for this tapestry would be her masterpiece, the culmination of all her skill and imagination. But when she sat down to begin, she discovered that her basket of thread, which she had carefully gathered and organized, had become a tangled mess. The vibrant reds, cool blues, deep greens, and golden yellows were knotted together in such a way that it seemed impossible to tell one thread from another. The more she looked at it, the more hopeless it seemed. Frustration immediately took hold of her. She began to pull at the threads, trying to loosen them with force. But the more she tugged and yanked, the tighter the knots became. Hours passed, and her hands grew sore from the effort, but the problem only worsened. What had once been a clear vision of beauty now felt like an impossible task. Her mind raced with thoughts of failure. If I cannot even untangle the threads, how can I hope to weave the masterpiece I've imagined? She thought. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, the weaver's frustration turned to despair. She had poured all her hopes into this tapestry, and now it seemed that her dream would never come to life. She sat back in her chair, staring at the tangled mess in front of her, feeling utterly defeated. At that moment, an elderly woman, wise in her years, passed by the weaver's home. Seeing the distress on the weaver's face, the woman stopped and asked, "What troubles you, my dear?" The weaver, too weary to hide her frustration, replied, "I had everything prepared to begin my greatest work, but my threads have become hopelessly tangled. I've tried for hours to untangle them, but no matter what I do, the knots only grow tighter. My tapestry, my dream, is ruined before it has even begun." The elderly woman looked at the basket of tangled threads and then back at the weaver. She nodded thoughtfully and said, "May I offer you some advice?" The weaver, though doubtful that anything could help at this point, agreed. She had nothing left to lose. The elderly woman gently picked up the basket of threads and held it in her hands. "Before you can untangle these threads, you must first stop pulling at them with frustration and force," she said softly. "When you struggle against a problem in haste, you often make it worse. Instead, you must let go for a moment. Breathe. Approach the problem with patience and care." The weaver, still unsure, took a deep breath and sat back. The elderly woman began to work on the threads, but she did not pull at them as the weaver had. Instead, she loosened her grip on the tangled mass and studied it carefully. She searched for the loose ends, those threads that could be freed with the gentlest touch. One by one she began to separate them, working slowly and methodically. At first, the weaver watched impatiently, wondering if this slow approach could really work. But as she watched, she began to see the knots loosen. Threads that had seemed hopelessly entangled began to separate, and slowly but surely, the basket of knotted thread became a pile of smooth, organized strands, ready to be woven into something beautiful. The weaver, astonished by what she had witnessed, looked at the elderly woman with gratitude and wonder. "How did you do it?" she asked. "I struggled for hours, pulling and yanking at the knots, but you untangled them so easily." The elderly woman smiled kindly and replied, "You were so focused on the tangled mess as a whole that you could not see the smaller knots that needed your attention first. Often, when faced with a problem, we become overwhelmed by its size and complexity. But if we take a step back and breathe, we can begin to see the smaller, simpler parts of the problem that we can solve. When you focus on those, the larger problem begins to unravel on its own. Solving one part at a time is the key to unraveling the whole." The weaver, humbled by the wisdom of the elderly woman, thanked her deeply. She realized that her frustration had blinded her to the simple solution that had been in front of her all along. With renewed hope, she picked up the smooth threads and began to weave. The tapestry she created became the masterpiece she had envisioned, filled with beauty and life. #Jesus Wisdom on Problem Solving. When Jesus finished the story, the disciples sat quietly, each one reflecting on the lesson within it. They could see themselves in the weaver's shoes, struggling against the problems they faced, trying to force solutions where patience was needed. After a moment of silence, Jesus spoke again, his voice filled with compassion. "The tangled threads in the weaver's basket are like the problems you face in life. Often, when you encounter difficulties, your first instinct is to pull and struggle, hoping to fix everything at once. But when you approach problems with frustration and haste, you only make the knots tighter. The wisdom of the elderly woman teaches us that we must first step back and breathe. We must let go of the need to solve everything immediately and instead approach the problem with patience. Begin with what is simple, the loose ends that you can work on now. Do not try to force the whole solution at once, but take small steps, working carefully and thoughtfully. As you do, you will find that the larger problem begins to unravel on its own. And remember," Jesus continued, "you do not face these problems alone. Just as the weaver found help in the wisdom of the elderly woman, so too can you find help in one another and most importantly in God. When you seek guidance from the Father and trust in His wisdom, He will show you the loose ends, the parts of the problem that can be solved with patience and care. Trust that even the most tangled mess can be made into something beautiful." Jesus looked at Peter, whose earlier frustration had mirrored the weaver's struggle. "Peter," he said gently, "do not be discouraged when the solutions do not come immediately. Remember that every knot has a loose end. Sometimes it is hidden, but it is always there. With patience and perseverance you will find it. The solution will come, not through force but through understanding." Peter, moved by Jesus' words, nodded. He realized that he had been trying too hard to solve everything all at once, and in doing so he had missed the smaller, more manageable steps that could have led to the solution. Jesus then turned to the rest of the disciples, his eyes filled with love and wisdom. The challenges you face will not always be simple, and the path to solving them may not always be clear. But with patience, trust, and the help of God, every problem can be unraveled. Do not be afraid of the tangled threads in your life. Approach them with calmness and trust that with time, understanding, and faith, the solution will come. The disciples rose, feeling lighter and more hopeful than before. As they continued their journey, they carried with them the lesson of the weaver and the tangled threads, knowing that with patience, trust, and a steady hand, no problem was too complex to solve. They had learned that true wisdom lay not in forcing solutions, but in trusting the process and seeking guidance from God, step by step. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.